there's this one image from my childhood that's seared into my brain, and I don't really know why. It's not particularly dramatic or notable. I'm about 10 years old, and I'm taking this long drive with my family. We're going on vacation. Outside, it's gray and wet. I've got my sister sitting next to me in her car seat. My parents are up front talking about parenty stuff. And I'm there in the back seat. I've got my little foam headphones on, my Discman, and ABBA's greatest hit CD spinning furiously inside it. I'm listening to Chiquitita like it's my job, and I'm thinking like, yeah, I am enchained by my own sorrows. And that's pretty much all I remember from that family trip. It's me sitting in the car with every cell of my body vibrating to ABBA's music. It's sort of a mundane scene, but I think the reason why it stands out to me is because that band and that CD, it was really one of the first times I was starting to step outside of the music my parents listened to. You know, there's only so much Frank Sinatra a tween can handle. And started developing music tastes of my own. Plus, it was a gift from my babysitter, so that was a plus. And it was probably a good thing that I was starting to form my own identity because young Simone, she had some qualities that were a little annoying. No offense, love you, girl. But I was a teacher's pet. I loved school, and like not in a charming way. Like I would ask for extra homework sometimes. It was bad. But I loved learning, and I kept this love of learning through middle school and high school. And consistently, one of my favorite classes would always be history. And I think that's because the lectures would often feel like the story time hour. You know, you'd have these power struggles and these epic rises and these catastrophic falls. Plenty of drama and action to keep me engaged. But then test time would roll around, and that I hated. Because with the test, it was all these names and dates, this treaty, that battle, blah, blah, blah. That kind of turned me off to the whole idea of history because it took this thing, these stories that felt so full of life and made them feel so dead. I don't know, maybe you relate to that too. Of course, I still cared about acing the test, so I'd cram in all that information, and then as soon as I handed in my test, poof, it would evaporate, but whatever, right? I had no plans to be a historian. Fast forward a few years, several years, I moved to Brooklyn, and I start working in the glamorous world of audio storytelling. And a few years in, I get offered, truly a dream job, to host a podcast. Amazing, right? Except this would be for a history podcast. So I'm thinking like, damn it, I don't even remember what the Zoot Suit riots are. Like, am I really cut out for this? So I say that to the people hiring me. I'm like, hey, listen, thank you, but just so you know, like, I'm not a history buff like that. I'm more of a K-pop Real Housewives girly, not so much the complete life and legacy of Richard Nixon kind of girl. By the way, if you're ever offered your dream job, I would not recommend this strategy. But in this case, they were like, yeah, that's perfect. And I was like, huh? Yeah, okay, perfect. And we started developing the podcast that would eventually become Not Past It. So I agreed to host the show. And in the beginning, all we know is that we'll be telling stories from that week in history. But beyond that, it's sort of TBD. So me and our team of producers, we're throwing around ideas for our first batch of episodes, and I'm feeling nervous. I'm like, oh God, what's gonna be my angle into these stories? How am I gonna make Thomas Jefferson feel fun and fresh and hip and new? And then one of our producers pitches us this episode, connecting this one Nazi invasion to the birth of ABBA. Okay, now we're talking. And this producer, they draw a line from this one Nazi battle to the party's policy, to the Eurovision Song Contest, to ABBA's birth and their rise in the music charts, to Broadway jukebox musicals. until finally landing with Meryl Streep in overalls and beachy waves in Mamma Mia the musical. I gotta tell you, this episode was a total Criss Angel mind freak for me for a few different reasons. First of all, to go from something so dark to something so joyful just highlighted a level of chaos in the world that honestly makes my head spin if I think about it too long. But more importantly, I remember learning about World War II in school, and it had never felt connected to my life in any real way. Okay, yes, maybe in the sort of larger geopolitical, socio-cultural shaping of the world kind of way, but never quite so up close and personal. And I realized if we were going to tell stories from history in a way that would connect with people, we had to do two things. First of all, we had to bring the drama, like my favorite teachers in school. We had to tell these stories in a way that brought them to life. And number two, we had to make some sort of vital personal connection to the stories we were telling, whether that was connecting it to current events unfolding before our eyes or to moments in my own life. I was starting to see that history was so much closer to me than I realized. And do you know that thing you see in the car in the side view mirror, that text, objects in mirror are closer than they appear? That's a bar. It's borderline poetry, but it's also the lesson we started to infuse in every single episode we told. A few episodes come to mind where we were seeing the past and present collide, but there was one in particular where the theme of cancel culture kept coming up, which we think of as a fairly modern phenomenon. But this was for a story about Josephine Baker. Now, if you don't know, Josephine Baker was a Black American performer. She danced, she acted, but fairly early on in her career, she moved to Paris because she wasn't receiving the opportunities she deserved in the segregated United States. But in 1951, at the height of her fame, she agrees to a US tour. So that fall, Josephine is in the US and she pays a visit to the Stork Club. It's this swanky spot in New York City. So she goes, she orders a steak, a glass of wine, but after an hour of waiting, still no service. Turns out the Stork Club had a sort of unofficial policy of discouraging Black patronage. So humiliated, Josephine leaves, and she proceeds to tell anyone she can about what happened to her that evening, including this one very famous and powerful gossip columnist. But instead of helping her, he ends up going after her in the press and launches an accusation that is particularly damning in the midst of American McCarthyism. He calls her a communist. All of a sudden, Josephine's US tour is canceled. She lands on a government watch list. The FBI opens up a file on her. She leaves the US, and she is not allowed to return for 10 more years, at the end of which she is nearly bankrupt. If this had happened today, we might say that Josephine Baker was canceled. And for real canceled, not just faces consequences for a pattern of bad behavior, but exiled from her own country for speaking up about the racism she faced. It wasn't such a big leap for us to try to figure out how to tell her story in a way that felt engaging and relevant, because the way those events played out, I recognize that from my own lifetime. And it's funny, when we talk about cancel culture now, the conversations we have tend to paint it as a phenomenon of the social media age, but if the cancel culture we're talking about is people publicly facing consequences, that's not new, especially for people who've been excluded from centers of power. In the case of Josephine, well, perhaps she was canceled, but could we really apply it to our modern parlance? The internet did not invent consequences. There's another episode we worked on that really brought home this idea of how familiar history can feel. This one is a classic story from US history. Maybe you even remember learning about it in school. the Scopes monkey trial. It was basically this fight from 100 years ago over whether or not evolution should be taught in schools. Now, culture wars over what should be taught in schools, maybe this rings a bell. Replace the word evolution with critical race theory, with gender and sexuality, or even just US history straight up, and the conversation starts to sound shockingly similar to the ones we're having today. We started to make these connections across history in every single episode we made, and it didn't just shift how I was thinking about history, but it started to shift how I think about time. You know, I used to think about time as a sequence of discrete events, sort of like links on a chain. But now I think of it as a web of interconnected moments, folding over on itself over and over again. And I think what's true for all of us is that the better we understand our history, the better equipped we'll be to handle our present. When we start to recognize patterns that have happened throughout the course of history and see just how close they are to us, we can start to wrap our arms around what's happening right now. We'll be less likely to fall for deceptive righteousness or be swayed by fear. And hopefully, we'll feel empowered to act on the things that we see that need changing. History is urgent, it's relevant, and it's in our best interest to get the fullest, most accurate picture of it. Just ask the girl sitting in the back seat of the family car, listening to her ABBA CD. She looks at her dad sitting in the front seat and glances over at the side view mirror. She doesn't realize it yet, but she will soon learn. Objects in the mirror are much, much closer than they appear. Thank you.